The Catholic tradition considers the Apostle Peter to be the first pope and the founder of the Church in Rome. But what does the historical record say? Today, Dr. Bart Ehrman joins me to discuss where this idea came from, whether Peter was ever in Rome, and what historians know about the founding of early churches. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Before we get started today, a quick heads up that Bart has recently announced his next big cruise, and he is really excited about this one. It's a 2-week expedition in June 2026 from Bergen, Norway, all the way up to Svalbard. Yes, the polar bear capital of the world. He's been wanting to do this route forever, and what he's really looking forward to is time with all of you. Long conversations over great meals, exploring the breathtaking coastline and majestic fjords together, and sharing brand new material about who chose the 4 Gospels. This is the topic of Bart's new book, and you'll be the first to hear what he's thinking about it all. If you're interested in joining Bart on the cruise, there's a special $300 discount if you book by December 15th. Just head to bartehrman.com/Norway for all the details. Welcome back, everybody, to Misquoting Jesus, where today we're talking about whether or not the Apostle Peter founded the church in Rome. We've also got listeners' questions at the end, where I'll be asking Bart his thoughts on Exorcism and whether the New Testament can be considered an early work of fantasy literature. So make sure you stick around for that, because frankly, I want to hear the answer to that particular question. But before we get into all of that, how are you doing this week?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I'm, working, able now to kind of devote more time to my research projects, and I'm working on my next book on how we got the canon of the New Testament. And so this is the fun part of writing a book, where you just read and read. You don't have to worry about like coming up with ideas or anything. You just read and enjoy and kind of think of things, and it's the best part. The hard part's writing, and the most God, such a drudge. Once you're done writing it, editing it, and copy editing, all that kind of stuff. But reading and thinking is great.
When you're in the kind of beginning reading and thinking phase, are you a copious note taker?
I am. I take notes on everything that I read that's of importance. Sometimes, you can sometimes summarize an entire book in 3 sentences, because it's not teaching you anything you don't know already, but you want to know kind of their angle. And sometimes you have to take copious notes, like on every chapter. And if you read an article, sometimes you can just summarize briefly, and sometimes you have to fill out a page or two. And so I don't like that part. I mean, I don't like the taking notes. That is painful. It's painful. But if you're just reading and enjoying, that's good. But you're right. I mean, the problem is you can't, when you're doing this, when you're actually really doing it, you got to take notes, and unless you remember everything, which I don't. I remember precisely nothing. So,
I was going to say I remember exactly nothing. It's quite irritating.
So how are you doing right now?
Yeah, good, thank you. Everything is just kind of ticking along as normal. Children healthy and happy. Christmas is looming.
Whoa. So it is.
Looming in a good way. We're going to take the kids home to stay with my sister for Christmas, which will be wonderful, but logistically will be challenging. So I'm pretending that I have more time than I actually do, which is probably not a good strategy for future Megan's stress levels.
Right. Yeah, 90% of the problem with children is logistics.
Yes, they keep moving.
Yeah. Oh God.
They move and they need all the things. Anyway. To open for this episode, I would like to ask you, what is the oddest email you've ever received after publishing a new book?
Oh, now that's an interesting question. And I don't know that I've got like a single email that I've gotten that's like, wow, weird, because I get a lot of weird emails. But there are certain kinds that I get, like after publishing a book, that I always find a little bit puzzling. I'll publish a book, and I'll get an email from somebody who says, it's the same book you published before, and I'm trying to figure out, what are they talking about? It's like, it's not. Did they read either book? Or even worse, when somebody will say, So like you argue that this, and that can't be right. And what they summarize what I argued is not what I argued. And again, you just wonder, do people actually read the book? They don't take copious notes. We were just talking, or if they do, they don't take them correctly. And so it's a little bit frustrating. You put all this work into a book, and then people complain about it without having like paid attention to it. What? So I get those kinds of things, and not just right after either. I mean, years later, I'll get stuff. You argue this. I didn't. Oh well.
That sounds quite frustrating.
Yeah.
Anyway, on to Peter. Do we have any idea, to go back to the very beginning, what Peter did following the death of Jesus? Do we know where he traveled to, what kind of activities he was engaged in?
Okay, so our only sources of information would be the Gospels, the New Testament, and the Book of Acts, and they give different indications, and so in different sources he does different things. In Matthew and presupposed in Mark, he goes right after the crucifixion. He goes back to Galilee, and it's there that he and the others have a vision of Jesus. In Luke's Gospel and in the Book of Acts, he stays in Jerusalem. In either case, we learn from them and from Paul that he had some kind of vision of Jesus, that he believed he saw Jesus alive, and Christians would say, well, Jesus appeared to him, and others could say, well, he thought he saw Jesus. And that led then to him becoming the kind of the center of attention for the other people who believed Jesus was raised from the dead, because Peter had been Jesus' right-hand man in all the Gospels. I think it's historically almost certainly right that Peter was the closest disciple, and so they rallied around him. And in a sense, he's the one then who starts the Christian movement, because he's the leader of the community after Jesus' death.
So do you think it's fair to say that he's kind of the main power, the main force behind the formation of the early church?
I think so. I mean, you could make an argument, and I actually do, and I have a book called Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene, which has it's 6 chapters on Peter, 6 on Paul, 6 on Mary Magdalene, and I had great fun writing this book. But in that book, I make an argument. You could actually make a serious argument that Mary Magdalene founded Christianity, because in the Gospels, she's the first to recognize that Jesus is raised from the dead, and she tells the others. And if she begins the proclamation that Jesus has been raised from the dead, that's what Christianity is based on. So you could say that it's based on Mary Magdalene's proclamation. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. The other sources indicate that Peter was the first to see Jesus, and it's certainly the case that Mary Magdalene was not the leader of the early Christians. Peter was early on, and that's clear from the Book of Acts. And it's the thing that makes the most sense. We don't know how long it was, but after some time, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes the principal leader of the church in Jerusalem. But to begin with, it looks like it was almost certainly Peter.
So do we have, or rather, what is our earliest evidence for an established church in Rome?
In Rome? Yeah. So the way it works, in the Book of Acts, which is not, Acts cannot be taken as a absolutely historical, reliable account of what happened, because there are lots of problems with Acts historically. But the basic story it tells is completely plausible and almost certainly right. That the movement started out with Jesus' followers, and they're in Jerusalem in Acts. So they must have come back to Jerusalem, or Acts says they stayed there. But so they're in Jerusalem, and they start converting people. I don't think they converted tens of thousands of people the way that Acts narrates, but they converted people. Eventually, the movement starts spreading, and it spreads to other regions of Judea. Eventually, it goes up into Galilee, goes to Samaria, and it starts spreading out. As it spreads out, people convert, and they take the message elsewhere, and people convert, and eventually, somehow or other, the message gets to Rome. So if Jesus died around the year, say 30 or 33, somewhere in there, Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome, probably around the year 60 or 62, sometime in the early 60s. And by that time, there's a fairly large church represented in Rome. And Paul's writing to it. He's never been there, but he's writing to it because he wants to visit it. He's wanted to for a long time, he says. So there's been a church in Rome, I would assume, for a couple of decades, maybe, by that. And it's the first reference to there being a church in Rome.
Now, does this letter show us anything about Peter's relationship to the church there?
The letter does not, no. I mean, it's one of the striking things about Paul's letter is that at the end of the letter, he greets a large people by name, over 25 people he greets by name. Even though he's never been there, he knows people who happen to be there, probably, because he'd met them somewhere else and they lived there or they went there for some other reason. And he greets over 25 people by name, and Peter's not one of them. And he certainly knew Peter. Paul tells us about his knowing Peter he's met with Peter 2 times in Jerusalem. The first time Paul ever went to Jerusalem after his conversion was to meet with Peter. And then he went years later and met with Peter and James and John there in Jerusalem. And he tells them about an episode in the city of Antioch where he and Peter were both ministering and working among Christians and apparently trying to convert people. And they have a big argument in Antioch that Paul relates. And so Paul knew Peter quite well. And he greets the people he knows in Rome. He doesn't mention Peter. And so that's I think that's got to show that Peter wasn't there.
So do we know how the church in Rome was organized? Was there some kind of structure or hierarchy from the beginning with a bishop who would have been in charge, or was it more of an informal organization?
Well, again, our only real information comes from Paul, who writes his letter to the Romans. We can infer a lot of things from that letter. He talks about people who hold houses in their homes. He names some people who have household churches. And given that he knows by name over 25 people, it's there's got to be a lot of Christians there. These are just the ones he knows by name, and he's never even been there. So I don't know what there are, 100, 200, how many people? But they're meeting in homes. There were no church buildings built we don't have evidence of church buildings for another 200 years. And so people were meeting in homes, basically. And, homes had to be homes of the rich because most people were living in tiny apartments with many people in them. And so they couldn't house a church on a Sunday. But so there are some rich folk in town, but they would have been scattered throughout Rome. So Rome was a big city. It was the largest city in the Roman Empire. It was probably 1 million people at this time and spread out. So that so there are churches in various areas, and Paul gives no indication that there's a hierarchy structure of some kind in the church. He doesn't talk about them having a bishop or having elders or having deacons or having in the sense of being like organized body structure. Certainly doesn't mention a leader in the church. He mentions people who have churches in their homes, and presumably people who had them in their homes, they were the leaders of the church. So no, we don't know of any kind of hierarchical structure such as comes about later.
Do we see in other cities at the same time a similar setup with people holding services in their homes without any kind of centralized structure, or do other cities seem to have someone in charge with other people underneath them?
The evidence is somewhat mixed on that because our evidence for Christianity before the year 60, so from the years 30 and 60, all of our evidence comes from Paul, because his writings are the only ones we have from that time period. And so we know mainly about his own churches in places like throughout the region of Galatia, and in he's been in Antioch, so we know about things there. But his churches in Corinth, for example, or Thessalonica, or in Philippi. And the most information we get about how a church was run is in the letters to the Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because it's all about church problems. And the striking things about First Corinthians is that the church there is riddled with problems. Um, Problems with Christian ethics, problems with internal tensions within the churches, problems with misbehavior, problems with how they're practicing their rituals, their practices, and so theological problems. And Paul addresses these problems. But it's interesting that when he addresses these problems to the Corinthians, he doesn't write to the leaders. He doesn't write the elders and say, look, get your people in order. And he certainly does not write to a bishop, somebody who's in charge of the church. The word, just to clarify, the word bishop in English is actually a translator of the Greek word episkopos. And episkopos, the word episkopos literally means an overseer. And so the bishop is the one who looks over the church, who's the main guy in charge. And it's always a guy in this period. And so he doesn't write to the bishop, doesn't write to the elders or the deacons. The church is organized in Corinth. They're organized by the Holy Spirit. They believe they all have spiritual gifts, and these gifts are allowing them to function together as a Christian community. And so in that picture, there's no hierarchy at all. When you get to the letter to the Philippians, Paul does mention the elders and the deacons. He greets the elders and the deacons. So it looks like there, at least, you've got some people who are taking on some kind of responsibilities in the church. They wouldn't have been full-time pastors, but they would have been people who had maybe charge of both the spiritual needs of the church and the physical needs of the church. So, people are taking care of alms collection or taking care of the poor, but also people who are like, mainly teachers and guidance counselors and things. So there, it looks like there's some kind of structure that's developing, but you don't really get a structure development where you get like a bishop and people under him until the end of the first century.
Thank you. We are going to take a brief break for some announcements, and then we'll be right back to investigate really where this link between Peter and the church in Rome came from. Now, everyone, this is your last chance. Bart is going to be debating Christian apologist Mike Licona this Thursday, that's the 20th of November, on the topic of who wrote the Gospels. It's an in-person debate in Boston, so if you are near Boston, you could absolutely attend live. And if you can't, then there will be a virtual option also. We're including a ticket to the virtual event in the Biblical Studies Academy, but you do have to register. So please be sure to check your email or Inside of Circle if you're a member of Biblical Studies Academy for more details on that. If you're not a Biblical Studies Academy member, then you can learn more both about the BSA and about the debate, and also purchase tickets for the debate at bartehrman.com/Boston. Now, it's been a while since you've done a debate with someone, Bart. How are you feeling about it?
Mixed. I enjoy debates on one level because I love developing arguments and countering arguments and trying to figure out what actually is the case. But they're always complicated because people who attend debates already for a debate like this already have a view of things, and they don't really. Very few people are going with an open mind. They're willing to have their beliefs challenged. And everybody grew up knowing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and everybody says they did. And the Gospels have those as their titles, and so so why not? And so like it gets and it's like you're. It's very difficult in that kind of situation, and surely that's what this crowd's going to be. I assume. I don't know. So, but I like debating with Mike because Mike's a good guy, and we get along. We're friends, but we just fundamentally disagree on many issues connected with Christianity. But we rarely go for the jugular. Which is good because that's to nobody's advantage.
I moderated the debate you two did on the resurrection several years back, and I do remember it being very civil and a very enjoyable low blood pressure event. So I'm looking forward to watching this one too.
Well, it was like 7 hours, wasn't it? It
was a whole day thing. Yeah,
it was all day, and wow, yeah. And it wasn't just repeating ourselves over and over again. I mean, but it's like that with this debate. This could be an all-day debate because the issues really are really complicated. And that's the other problem with the debate is it's hard to convince somebody without actually getting into the evidence. And to get into the evidence takes time. And you just don't have time. Oh, here, do a 20-minute presentation. Right. Are you kidding me? So but so goes. That's the nature of the beast.
Well, I hope it goes well. An audience, again, if you are interested in that, you can go to bartehrman.com/Boston for more details and to purchase tickets. Now, back to Peter and Rome. What is the earliest reference we have for the link between Peter and the church in Rome?
Well, that's a little bit hard to say. The first, I guess, I think, it depends how you date things. That's why it's hard to say. The book of First Peter is a book that claims to be written by Peter, that there are very good reasons for thinking Peter did not write. Among them being that a Aramaic-speaking fisherman from Galilee would not have had the education that he would need in order to write a composition like this, let alone write it in a second language. It took years and years to learn how to read and write in the ancient world, and to read and write in a second language was like almost nobody could do it like that. And so it's unlikely this fisherman could do it. So somebody else is writing later, claiming to be Peter. But at the end of it, the author says that he is sending his greetings from Babylon. Now, it's quite clear this author is not writing in Babylon. Babylon became a nickname for the city of Rome after the year 70, because Rome destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple the way the Babylonians had, the way Babylon had 600 years earlier. And so Christians started calling Rome Babylon, as in, for example, the book of Revelation. So the author's using a code word saying, I'm writing from Rome. And so depending on when you date First Peter, that would probably be the first connection of Peter with Rome. I date it to the end of the first century. I don't know when it was written, 70, 80, somewhere in there, long after Peter's death. The other thing that people use to connect Peter with Rome is the book of First Clement. First Clement we actually can date. It's written to around the year 95. It's called First Clement because allegedly it's written by a man named Clement, who in tradition was the third or fourth bishop of the city of Rome. The book actually doesn't claim to be written by Clement, and so it's people later saying it's written by Clement, but it is written by the church in Rome. It's written by a collective in Rome to the church in Corinth. And in this book, early on, this Roman audience talks about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. And so some people use that to show that Peter was probably martyred in Rome. Unfortunately, this book doesn't say he was martyred in Rome. It just mentions that he got martyred. And so it's kind of a loose connection.
Is there any other evidence that Peter was probably martyred in Rome, or is this it?
Well, this is the beginning of the tradition. So there are later traditions that are highly legendary. Sometimes people have trouble, believing me when I say, well, something's legendary. And so if you don't believe it's legendary, you read the Acts of Peter and you tell me if it's legendary. The Acts of Peter is a late 2nd century text that describes Peter being martyred in Rome. The interesting thing about that text, by the way, is that the text is quite explicit that Peter did not establish the church in Rome. Paul was there before him in that text. Peter has to go to Rome because Paul's left Rome to go for a further mission. And the people in Rome need an apostle. So they write Peter, say, Peter, you got to come help us here. And so he not only wasn't the founder, he wasn't the leader of the church in the earliest legends we have connecting him with Rome.
Do we have any non-legendary accounts or evidence that suggests that Peter even went to Rome while he was alive?
No. Well, what we know about Peter would not make it impossible that he went to Rome. What we learned from Paul about Peter is that not only was he a pillar in the Church of Jerusalem, one of the mainstays for this church in Jerusalem, but that he was chosen to take the gospel message to Jews, just as Paul was chosen to take the message to Gentiles. And so I mentioned earlier that Peter and Paul were both in Antioch. Peter is with the Jewish Christians in Antioch, and Paul is with the Gentiles, wishing they were both be together. But Paul also mentions in the book of 1 Corinthians that Peter goes on missionary journeys, and he takes his wife with him. Paul's trying to make a point about Peter being a missionary. He just casually says that, Peter takes his wife with him, but I don't take a wife, and so I have the right to, but I don't. He's just making that point. But it shows that Peter was going around as a missionary. He would have been ministering to Jews, and so if he did go to Rome, it would have been to try to convert Jews. But he couldn't have been the one who started the church in Rome, because when Paul writes the letter to the Romans, he tells us this large number of people in Rome. He tells us that they are Gentiles. In chapter 1, he actually names them and says they're Gentiles. So if Peter was there, Paul gives no indication of it, and there's no indication at that point that there's a large Jewish community that Peter's converted.
So you explained how this association, this link between Peter and the city of Rome seems to have started. When do we see church tradition stating that Peter actually was the first bishop in Rome and he founded the church himself?
So we start getting traditions about Peter in Rome in some of the writings of the early church fathers. The church fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries start identifying Peter as bishop. You have writers like Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, and then you get people like Eusebius in the early 4th century, who wrote a history of the early Christian church, who identify Peter as a founder of Rome. But there are confusing traditions. Some indicate that Peter and Paul together founded the church in Rome. Some indicate Peter did, some indicate Paul did. Some indicate that Peter was the bishop of other churches. One tradition links Peter, that is mentioned in Eusebius, says that Peter was the first bishop of Antioch. And so it's confusing, so the entire bishopric lineage in Rome is confusing, because there are several names involved: Peter, Paul, Linus, Anicetus, and Clement. And who was when and where and whether there's evidence of it's hard to know. But I'll stress. So you start getting it at the end of the 2nd century that Peter started the church in Rome.
Why would early Christians have wanted to ascribe the founding of the church in Rome, specifically Rome, to Peter?
What ends up happening is that the Christianity is being established mainly in urban areas around the Mediterranean, because missionaries are more likely to go to densely populated areas where they can reach more people. We don't know a lot about missionaries at the time, but the only ones we really know by name are Paul and Cephas in the New Testament period. So they mainly go to urban areas, but also people in urban areas are where the wealth is. The wealthy people tend to live in cities, not in rural areas. And the cities are where there's a lot of traffic coming in and out. And so people travel to places if they've got funds. Maybe they're traveling for business, maybe they're going for leisure. And so you have people who have become Christian who travel to Corinth, or who travel to Antioch, who travel to Alexandria, Egypt, or who travel to Rome. They travel to major cities. And so sometimes traveling people who aren't like officially missionaries, they're just business people or whatever, go to a city and they'll convert people there, and family members, for example, or neighbors of family members and such. And so what happens over time is that the larger cities start developing the larger churches. And so eventually, by the 2nd or 3rd century, you get churches in, you have a church in Jerusalem early on, but you've got a church in Antioch that becomes a large church, a church in Rome that's a large church, a church in Alexandria that's a large church. And so you have these large churches. And the interesting thing is all of them want to be somehow connected by direct lineage to Jesus. And how do you get direct lineage to Jesus? Is by one of his disciples or one of his apostles. So either Paul or one of the 12. If you can say that you are founded by that person, that gives you kind of a status growth. And so Peter gets associated with all these places. I mean, he's the leader in the church in Jerusalem. Eusebius says he became the bishop of Alexandria. His follower, by legend, his follower is Mark, who established the church in Alexandria. And Peter becomes, the founder of the church in Rome. And it kind of goes like that. And so Rome was claiming to have kind of a connection with Peter, but so were all these other churches. Rome, though, ends up becoming the dominant church. You start seeing signs of that already in the 2nd century. Irenaeus thinks of it as kind of the major church of Christendom. And so they assert their authority by claiming connection with Peter. And their claim sticks because they become the most powerful church.
I see. So it's purely a matter of authority, and because Rome is the biggest, most important church at the time, people are either not going to question them, or it just makes more sense that big, important church would have this direct connection.
Yeah, because if Peter is Jesus' right-hand man, and then he's the one who more or less begins the movement after Jesus, then if you can claim lineage back to Peter, then you got special authority. And what happens then is that the successors of, in the legends, Peter starts the church, or Peter and Paul, Peter starts the church, and then he appoints his successor. And so the successor can claim he has the authority of Peter. And then the successor to that successor claims to have the authority of Peter. And it goes down like that from Peter to however it goes, Linus, Anicetus to Clement, and down to the current Pope. They all claim a lineage of one to the other, going back to Peter, and so that gives them the authority of Jesus himself.
So if there's little evidence to show that Peter did go to Rome and that he was in fact the founder, do academics know how the church in Rome was founded?
Well, we don't know for sure. I mean, there are some good arguments against Peter that maybe I haven't quite filled out yet, but the arguments against Peter are things like, when Paul writes the church, it's almost all Gentiles, and Peter was a missionary to Jews. And so why aren't there Jewish communities there that Paul addresses? And so there's a lack of evidence for Peter even being there. There's, in fact, a good reason for thinking he wasn't there. And it appears to be largely a Gentile church. All the converts appear to be Gentiles. So, or almost all of them. So how was the church founded if Peter didn't found it? Paul certainly didn't found it, because when he writes the Romans, he says he's never been there, and he's writing to a number of churches. So how did it get founded? Well, we were talking earlier about how people are traveling around. Rome is the hub of the empire, and there are more people traveling in and out of Rome than any other place in the Western world at the time. Many scholars, I think, just assume that travelers ended up in Rome. Either there were people who lived in Rome who had traveled somewhere else for business or for whatever and spent time somewhere else in Ephesus or in Corinth or in Antioch and became Christian there and brought the message back. Or there are people who travel to Rome, who say immigrate to Rome, who happen to be Christian, and they go and they convert people there. They appear to be Gentiles that they're converting, and it starts to grow. It's a large city. People are packed in. In an urban setting like Rome, it was far more densely populated than anything today. Even in the most densely packed urban areas today, Rome in first century was more densely packed than that. And so news spreads quickly, ideas spread quickly. Philosophy spread quickly, religion spread quickly, because there's so much interaction going on. And so it started spreading quickly. All of that is before Paul even writes his letter in the 60s, early 60s, and Peter doesn't seem to be connected with the church there yet. And so the whole thing about Peter being the founder of the church appears to be a later legend based on the importance of having a direct tie back to Jesus through one of his apostles.
Thank you so much, Bart. That's about all we have time for today. So we are going to move on to this week's bonus segment, which is listeners' questions. Were the early Christian apostles as unified as they seemed? What if Peter and Paul, the two towering figures of early Christianity, were actually bitter rivals. The truth might surprise you. In the free course, Did Peter Hate Paul? Join New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman as he unpacks one of the most intriguing debates in Christian history. While the book of Acts paints a picture of harmony between all the apostles, other early Christian writings suggest there was deep-seated conflict. Did Peter truly resent Paul for his radical teachings? Why do Paul's letters hint at a heated dispute that remains unresolved? In this course, you'll explore these questions and more, diving into lesser-known texts and uncovering the evidence behind this historical mystery. Ready to discover the hidden tensions that shaped early Christianity? Visit bartehrman.com/Peter and Paul to sign up now for free access. And as a bonus, you'll receive lifetime access to the course, including lectures, Q&A sessions and more, a $30 value. Again, simply visit bartehrman.com/Peter and Paul, and it's yours at no charge. Okay, Bart, there are a couple here that I'm genuinely curious about, so I'm looking forward to hearing your answers. First up is, what are your thoughts on the concept of exorcisms? In the New Testament, Jesus casts out demons, and it is also recognized as a legitimate practice today by the Roman Catholic Church, in which priests evoke the power of Christ. As an agnostic atheist, how does one reconcile the possibility of such supernatural behavior? For example, if there are demonic forces at work, then there must also be forces for God.
Well, right. I mean, if an exorcism actually happens, if somebody casts a demon out of someone else, that means that there was a demon, and that means there's supernatural forces. So it's kind of hard for an atheist to say that. So I'll say several things about it. One is that exorcism is a cross-cultural phenomenon. It's not just Christian. It was, of course, in Judaism before Christianity came along, but it's also attested in numerous religions of spirits possessing bodies that can be cast out by a shaman or by a holy man. And so it is a cross-cultural phenomenon. And the question is how to explain it. If you explain it just on the basis of Christianity, you've got to explain the other things. And what about the others? Since it's a cross-cultural phenomenon, then there are clearly ways to explain exorcisms, because they involve all sorts of psychological and physical phenomena. And so, I think a lot of us think that there are incidents that happen like this, and psychosomatic instances are likely, I think, in many cases. Just as there are healings that are clearly psychosomatic, I think that kinds of mental disorders that are attributed to demons can be explained as healings of them can be explained psychosomatically, as an example. So I don't think that it proves that there's a supernatural realm. There are a lot of things we don't understand in life. I don't think near-death experiences explain that there has to be an afterlife. They happen throughout cultures, and it's part of the phenomenon we don't understand yet because we don't understand the brain very well yet.
Thank you. Dr. Ehrman makes the case for Jesus as an apocalypticist. Among scholars in religious studies, what are other contending theories that help to make sense of this figure?
Well, there are a lot of them. And so if you read any kind of honest book on the historical Jesus, they'll tell you there are lots of views other than the one I'm giving. When I started my book, my book was in 1999 about Jesus and Apocalypticism, and I started out listing the options. Jesus was a rabbi who taught love. Jesus was a Jewish holy man. Jesus was a cynic philosopher. That was a big one in the 1980s, that Jesus should be understood as a cynic philosopher. Jesus was a zealot. He was a revolutionary. Jesus was a Pharisee who was arguing Pharisees because they were so close to each other in their views. He was a different kind of Pharisee. So you can kind of go down the list. And so the question is, which one has the best evidence for it? And I think you have to look closely at the evidence before you make a decision. And so I just encourage people to look at the evidence. For people, I mean, it's kind of tempting to say, well, Jesus was he was a rabbi like other rabbis. He taught what rabbis taught. He taught, like, emphasized love maybe a little bit more than some others. And so that's who he was. But then when you have an explanation, one thing you definitely have to do is figure out, why did they crucify him? It wasn't for preaching a message of love. Romans did not kill people for loving others too much. So why? So you go through all the explanations and you see if it actually works with the data we have.
What mythological or fantastic creatures appear in the New Testament? For example, the Old Testament has Leviathan, angels, and demons. Does their presence classify the Bible as an early work of fantasy?
I don't think the Old Testament doesn't really have demons the way the New Testament does, because demons came in with apocalyptic Judaism after most of the Old Testament was written. But it does have spirits, and the Old Testament cherubim and seraphim and all sorts of divine beings, angels and such. And the New Testament definitely has angels, and it has principalities and powers and forces of darkness. It has read the book of Revelation, you'll see all sorts of wild things. And so then can it be classified as a work of fantasy? It depends how you mean it. And it depends whether if you're talking about a literary genre of fantasy. Somebody today who writes a fantasy is writing something that they know is fantastic, that is not something that is actually real. And so, and I enjoy fantasy, but it doesn't mean that I don't think it's real. Were these authors writing fantasy? Well, not if that's the definition, because they thought there really were principalities and powers in the world. There were forces of evil in the world. And so we could say it's fantasy in the sense that it doesn't line up with what we understand to be historical and scientific reality. But if we're asking if they were meaning to write fantasy, then the answer is no, I think. They actually thought this stuff was right.
Did Stoicism lay some of the groundwork for Christianity in the Roman Empire?
I deal with this in my forthcoming book on the ethics of Jesus. There are a number of books that argue that Paul was highly influenced by Stoic thinking, and I think there's some merit to that. But I think scholars sometimes take it too far. Often take it too far. Stoicism did maintain that there's an element of the divine written into nature, that the logos, the rationality, sometimes translated the word, but divine rationality, divine reason is written into our reality, into the world, so that if you understand the logos, the word, the reason, the rationality of existence, then you know how to live in accordance with it. And when you do that, that's how you can find a happy life. Christians argue that the logos is what created the world. The Word of God created the world, and the world is God's world, and God's Word is in the world and is manifest in the world. And so there are similarities in ways, but there are huge differences as well between Stoicism and Christianity. So I don't think Stoicism is like the major influence to start with Christianity, and Judaism is. And so I think, it started off as a Jewish sect, but eventually, as it spread, understandings of other traditions, including Stoic philosophy, did certainly influence the development of Christianity.
And our final question for today: do we have any way of knowing how widespread apocalyptic views were among Jews in Jesus' day compared to Sadducee and Pharisee views?
Well, as it turns out, Pharisees were apocalypticists. And so they too believed in, for example, the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. In the book of Acts, this is what divides the Pharisees from the Sadducees. Sadducees believe that death is the end of the story. There's no future resurrection. And Pharisees subscribe to the view of a future resurrection when there be a destruction of the powers of evil and the people would be raised from the dead, either to be judged negatively and destroyed or to be given an eternal reward. Pharisees believe that. They were apocalypticists. That's why Paul was an apocalypticist before he became a follower of Jesus. He understood Jesus apocalyptically because he was already an apocalypticist. So how widespread was the apocalyptic view? It appears to be fairly widespread. It starts about 200 years before Jesus, but there are a lot of apocalyptic writings we have that are not in the New Testament. The final book of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, written as the last book, is apocalyptic. All of the New Testament is apocalyptic, with the possible exception. Well, even the book of Luke is apocalyptic. John the Baptist was apocalyptic. Jesus was apocalyptic. Paul was apocalyptic. And what other Jews were? Pharisees were. Essenes were the ones who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Zealots appeared to have taken the views of the Pharisees, so they too were apocalyptic. So apart from the Sadducees, in terms of like official groups, I think probably all the others were apocalyptic. And what did the guy on the street think? I don't know. I don't know. But most of the Jewish writings we have, in some way or another, a lot of, not most of, a lot of them are apocalyptic. I'd say it's pretty widespread.
Bart, thank you so much. Audience, thank you all for your questions. And now, before we finish for the week, could you please remind us what we spoke about today?
So in this episode, we're talking about whether Peter was the founder of the church in Rome and its first bishop. And that is the tradition within Roman Catholicism. And it's what most people probably think. But there's very thin evidence for it and a good lot of evidence against it. We don't have traditions about this until much later, and there are good reasons for thinking the church was founded in some other way in Rome, and that Peter definitely was not the first leader.
Audience, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember, you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. Bart, what are we talking about next time?
Well, next week we're dealing with a problem that I've spent a lot of time thinking about that most people doesn't occur to them. Is there such a thing as an original text? People say, well, we have copies of the New Testament, we don't have the originals. Was there an original? What would that even mean? You say, of course there was an original. Was there? We're going to find out. It's an interesting topic.
Thank you all, and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.